Welcome to this presentation on workplace learning by Laura Bell, Ryan Harb, and Justin W. Rice, students at Louisiana State University for LHRD 7025. The objectives of this presentation are to provide you with an introduction to workplace learning and to provide context about how workplace learning is defined, how it has evolved, and how both individuals and organizations use workplace learning to meet the professional and sometimes personal development and training needs. As we will be discussing workplace learning, we are also discussing adult learning. Adult learning theories, or andragogy, are most often associated with Malcolm Knowles, who provided 4 principles for teaching adults. The 4 principles include involving adult learners in the planning of their education, using adult learners' experience, making the education relevant to the learners' lives, and making the learning process center. Also, we can add that adult learners want their instruction to be organized and appropriately designed for the audience. This slide exemplifies that we not only communicated the learning objectives on the previous slide, we have considered the learning outcomes to ensure adult learners can determine if the outcomes align with their personal learning needs. Objectives and outcomes are related, but learner expectations should be communicated clearly. While learning has been around for millennia and likely existed in ancient workplaces, it has been recorded since at least the late 1800s. It was during this period when industry and immigration intersected. In an effort to ensure the kind of workforce that would meet its needs was in place, management implemented programs to facilitate the creation of docile and obedient workers. As workplace learning began to develop, management education began to rise, and laws to promote education in schools and management education began. The corporation schools gave management the control in how workers would be trained. The rise in workplace education encouraged Ford Motor Company to implement the Ford English School for Foreigners, which was extremely successful. This was only the beginning of workplace learning, and the period of 1920 to 1970 saw the expansion of business education and higher education and the training departments within organizations. This forward momentum has continued to promote the evolution, acceptance, and creation of new, innovative ways of learning in the workplace and gain further legitimacy with the creation of human resource development. However, as workplace learning has developed and evolved, the locus of control has been challenged as well. Understanding who is in control of learning is vital for creating an effective and efficient workplace learning environment in the 21st century. Historically, workplace learning has been employer-dominated education and training. Typically, management determined the way in which training was offered and the outcomes expected of the employees in regards for their specific tasks and responsibilities. Management and supervisors were favored because they were the ones in charge of the work being completed, and workers' input was not generally taken into consideration when designing workplace training programs and initiatives. However, in the 21st century, in order to give workers more control over their learning, it has been suggested that there should be an emphasis on worker empowerment. Because workplace learning has traditionally been controlled by management and has occurred through formal training and development programs, it is important to look at and think differently about learning as it relates to the workplace. There are several ways in which organizations are overcoming the difficulties associated with traditional methods, including online delivery and instructional methods, as well as blended learning. In 2012, technology-based learning, which includes e-learning, online learning, and mobile learning, was used on average 39% of organizations' formal learning hours.
Myth number 1, workers don't have time for learning. The truth is, they will make time to learn if it fuels career growth. Workers spend 3.3 hours a week learning on their own versus just 37 minutes per week on their employer's training. And nearly 75% of workers have invested their own money in career-related development in the last year, spending an average of $339. Myth number 2, traditional training methods are obsolete. Nope, they're not actually obsolete, they're just incomplete. It takes the right mix. 70% of people take courses from their employers at least once a year, but bite-sized content dominates learning habits. 70% of people also reported that they learned something useful for their job in the last 24 hours, from an article, video, or book. Myth number 3, the L&D function knows learning best. Now, the responsibility for learning is shared between L&D managers and employees. Here's where workers go when they want to learn something new. 69% ask a boss or mentor for direction. 55% go to their colleagues. 47% search online, and 21% rely on their L&D department. So your L&D teams have 2 roles now, supplying and empowering. Embrace these roles by adapting your L&D strategy for today's learners.
This video addressed 3 myths about workplace learning. Workers do have the time, workers need guidance on finding appropriate learning materials, and there needs to be the right mix of new technology and traditional instruction. There are several types of learning that occur in the workplace, among which are skill development, seeking specific skills, licensure such as medicine, nursing, aviation, and commercial driving, learner compliance, accreditation, and insurance in the case of driving. There are several methods of workplace learning, including the traditional method, which includes face-to-face components, is traditionally instructor-led, and uses traditional delivery methods, concepts, and techniques. Another method is online, which is technology-based, reduces commuting time, and provides flexibility. And lastly, blended, which is a hybrid of face-to-face and technology-based delivery methods with the convenience of online methods, but the interpersonal interaction of face-to-face. This is important information to consider as workplace learning can include different generations who may not be as computer adept as other workplace learners. The right mix, as the video said, is the most important and should engage all learners in the workplace. A good example of this occurred a few years ago in the medical field. As hospitals and other organizations began to change to electronic medical records, all physicians and nurses needed to become adept at managing a computer system and being able to access critical information about a patient in a matter of seconds. This fundamentally changed how medicine is practiced. Whether it has been for the betterment or not is still yet to be determined. The challenge to provide staff training to large groups of hospital staff who enter a computer class with varied levels of computer comfort was a consideration for each and every instructor. Assessing this became a necessary part of every class, and physician learners needed to utilize face-to-face instruction for using a computer-based system. Using video modules did not provide enough personalized information and did not engage learners who were not used to learning that way. The face-to-face instruction helped create an engaging environment where all learners came together at various levels to learn. Don't take my word for it. Check out the video on the next slide.
Hi everyone, this is Melina. Today I'm going to be talking about using a blended learning model for corporate training. So what is blended learning? In a nutshell, blended learning is a way of teaching that combines online resources with in-person instruction to create a more personalized learning environment. But remember, blended learning is not intended to totally get rid of in-person training sessions. Unlike online courses and trainings where all materials and interactions are online, blended learning optimizes the face-to-face classroom time by transforming the role of an instructor from someone who passively delivers the information to trainees to a more active role as a guide on the side. What are the benefits of blended learning? First, blended learning makes classroom training efficient. Instructors can make the best use of their time in the classroom by asking the trainees to complete certain portions of the lesson online, such as basic concepts or theory. This frees up classroom time for in-depth treatment of the subject matter, which allows instructors to spend more time going over complicated concepts and answering questions. Next, it's employee-oriented and schedule-friendly with a human touch. Blended learning offers flexible scheduling options for employees at all levels of an organization, no matter what shifts or hours you work. You can be working in the office, in your bed, in a cafe, or essentially anywhere with an internet. Lastly, blended learning saves time and money. When you move a part of your training program online, the time spent in the classroom is reduced. Online training costs less than in-person training sessions. Training facility rental and other supplemental costs can raise the price even more. Without these costs, employees can be trained in a way that fits within the company's budget. Using blended learning for corporate training is not only efficient, cost-effective, and engaging, but also a more natural way to learn. Empower your employees to become active participants in your company's success by putting them through a well-designed, learner-centered training program. Thank you for watching.
It is important to revisit the learning process, especially as we discuss adult workplace learning. For adult learning and workplace learning, it's important to make the learning relevant, related to a problem, and something that will have immediate impact on the learner's knowledge and/or personal life, just as Malcolm Knowles described in his 4 principles of andragogy. Often, workplace learning involves experiential learning. Kolb described this theory of experiential learning and model in 1984. As you can see, the model moves the learner through thinking, experiencing, grasping, and transforming. The learning cycle basically involves 4 stages, namely concrete learning, reflective observation, abstract conceptualization, and active experimentation. Effective learning can be seen when the learner progresses through the cycle. The learner can also enter the cycle at any stage of the cycle with logical sequence. And you can easily apply this experiential learning to the aviation and medical industries. Pilots learn to fly in a simulator. We don't want them to learn how to take off and land a plane without having done it 1,000 times on a computer simulator. Medical students practice everything from needle punctures, CPR, and surgeries on high-tech mannequins. Through actually doing, in the environment that you work, you can apply your learning immediately. Here's a great example of workplace learning and experiential learning to help solidify the concept. Several years ago, LSU School of Medicine brought high-tech mannequins to rural hospitals in Louisiana to train the physicians and the nurses in the emergency room on how to deliver a baby. With hospital funding cuts across the state, many rural hospitals could no longer offer maternity and pediatric care. The hospitals had to cut these services due to funding and could now only provide critical access services. But pregnant women didn't know that and kept showing up at the hospital's emergency room, already in labor, and often the ER staff needed to deliver the baby in the hospital. Again, we look at the learning need, which is the healthcare providers needed more training, and we involve the learners in determining the content they really need. So we worked with the doctors and nurses and determined they wanted to know how to call for a referral, how to deliver a baby with shoulder dystocia, and they needed to know how to form the healthcare teams. LSU brought mannequins to the rural hospitals and set up in the actual emergency room and had the teams deliver a mannequin baby. Yes, it really can be done. There are special mannequins that do this. And they ran the simulation of this event with everyone taking the role, wearing the gown, gloves, and mask, and using the supplies they would as if this was an actual emergency. Many things occurred that were exactly as you would expect, but also the areas for improvement were very clear as well. Nurses couldn't locate warming blankets. Physicians couldn't find the right medications in the crash cart. You get the picture. But what happened is that in the end, the leaders came together and solved their problems and reorganized their policies and together addressed their learning needs through team-based experiential efforts that occurred at the workplace, or as it is called in medicine, the point of care. Now take a look at Kolb's learning cycle diagram again. Think about the medical scenario I just explained to you and see how the learning process and the concepts apply. Moving from concrete, learning like how to deliver a baby that won't come out easily, to reflecting upon the experience and what would have helped to conceptualizing solutions to the problem, to running a scenario again with the changes made, or active experimentation.
Arguably, the most natural and powerful form of learning is through experience, or more precisely, through reflection on doing. Also called experiential learning, it's what prima ballerinas do after their performance at the National Opera. But it also happens to boys that are sad because their father got angry when they played football in the living room. By the age of 1, we all had our own painful encounter with experiential learning when we tried to walk, failed, fell, and cried like, well, a baby. And even though this was an unpleasant and discouraging exercise that lasted for months, in the end, we all made it. How is that possible? As soon as we fell and the first shock was over, our brain unconsciously began to make sense out of all the information available to identify how this embarrassment occurred. It remembers that when we pushed ourselves up, everything was fine. Our feet on the floor, our arms in position, and our head and shoulders upright, ready to go. When our upper leg muscles pulled our left foot 12.3% to the front at an angle of 23 degrees, our arms didn't complement the movement, and the ventricles in the inner ear, responsible for static balance, got confused for a second. When at the same moment the cat ran by, our eyes sent an alarming signal to the hippocampus, and we completely lost it. Ouch. Unconsciously, this is how our brain analyzes the relationship of events within our body or in the environment. It happens all the time as we learn to walk, talk, kiss, function in a fancy office, or dance the salsa. Once we understand the connections between what went wrong, we know what we need to change when we try the next time. Experiential learning can also be used explicitly to learn a new skill or to become better at what we already love doing. Here is how it works. First, get yourself into a situation to experience. After, reflect on what happened. Then, try to understand the relationships to form an abstract concept. If I do A, I get B. Last, decide what to do differently next time. Then do it again. Experiential learning is also believed to be responsible for the fact that musicians generally fare better at most tests, regardless of what they measure. People that practice an instrument not only engage their brain in motor, visual, and auditory areas, but they also learn by reflecting on what they're doing with a fast feedback loop. A wrong tone on the violin sounds too terrible to remain unnoticed. While playing, they therefore not only learn to make music, but also that progress in general comes through practice, reflection, understanding, and repetition. You can use it with your friends or colleagues when working on a project. Silicon Valley startups do it when they tell their developers to get out of the building. After the interaction with real potential customers, the team gets together, analyzes the feedback, and decides what to do next. Tell us, what do you think? Is learning through reflecting on doing only good when acquiring new hands-on skills? Or is it also suitable to study science, math, the humanities, or abstract art?
Now that you have watched this video, think about how you as an adult learner would want to learn. Now think about how you would design a course for your coworkers to learn something. Do you want to just send them a PowerPoint? Or do you want to design your instruction to involve them in the process of learning something tangible that applies to the problem that has been discovered? Some key themes to workplace learning. Learning is part of everyday social practice. Teams are communities of practice identified and designed by their shared practice. Novices become experts through these communities of practice. Horizontal learning is as important as vertical learning in the workplace, and talk is a central part of practice. Learners need to learn to talk their way into expertise rather than just learn from the talk of an expert.
You represent the idea of workplace learning, a topic that has been on the agenda for many years now. What are currently the major discussions around workplace learning?
Well, I call it modern workplace learning because what I'm trying to differentiate it from is the fact that everything's all about training in the classroom or e-learning. In other words, creating things for people to do and make sure they do it. My idea of modern workplace learning is that we see learning as a much broader activity, that we learn in so many different ways inside and outside the organization, for ourselves and of course through things which are done for us. And I think learning and development's role now is to actually more to facilitate and enable these new ways of learning rather than just create, deliver and manage the old training ways. So that's what the new things we're talking about, how we can help people become independent learners, continuous learners, and how we can help managers help people get the most out of their jobs and learn from what they're doing in the workplace. So these are the big new ideas and areas which people really need a lot of help with.
When companies introduce workplace learning, where do they encounter the most difficulties?
Well, I was just having this conversation earlier actually, because they have a very traditional culture, which is everything is very hierarchical and everything is very controlled and top-down driven. Whereas for me, modern workplace learning is very much a bottom-up, self-organized, self-managed, self-facilitated, autonomous type of learning, and therefore there is a bit of a clash between them. A lot of managers do understand we need to change things and do things differently. but there's still a lot of old organizations that are finding it very difficult to shift their mindset, not only in the way work is organized nowadays, but the way learning and development happens in organizations. So they're the big questions at the moment.
Where are the biggest traps for the individual learner, in your opinion?
The biggest traps? Seeing learning and development as an important aspect of their future. In my presentation this morning, I showed how everybody needs to be continuously learning to keep up to date with the speed of work and the speed of knowledge, and the fact that they're probably not necessarily going to stay in their job for a very long time, and they need to think about their future. And so they tend to think it's unimportant, that what they need to learn will be done to them. But the big trap is allowing that to happen, because organizations don't really need to train you to do another job. They train you to do your job now. So everybody needs to be aware that they need to be continuously learning so that they can move forward. And that, of course, is another conflict. Organizations often want just to train people for the organization and jobs, and don't want to see the bigger picture. But in my opinion, the more they think about the future and supporting their employees for the future, it's a win-win for everybody.
Each year you ask learning professionals for their favorite tools for learning and publish your top 100 tools list. Which tools are on the top of the list and therefore the most interesting?
Well, actually it hasn't changed very much in the last few years. The top of the list this year was YouTube. Previous years it's been Twitter, but that really goes to show that people are using these tools which are not traditionally seen as training tools for their own learning, and more importantly for their continuous daily learning. They are frequently going on YouTube to find videos, and they're constantly interacting with their professional networks on Twitter and LinkedIn. So these are really the key tools for them. Some people realize they're learning every day. Not everybody realizes these are learning tools, but it's interesting that the top tools are really non-traditional training tools, and they always have been, actually, funnily enough. But I think it's organizations beginning to realize that this is the future.
And what do the results of your survey mean for the companies? How should they react to them?
Well, I think the survey is a tool survey, but actually it shows user behavior, learning behavior, and it shows that individuals are learning both from training and classroom training, but they don't see that as the most important way of learning. They learn from web courses that they take themselves, but they're also learning, as I said earlier, more regularly from content that's coming to them in a daily way or through their professional networks, and they're also learning from their daily work. So the companies need to recognize that the modern professional learns in all these many different ways, and so the future is actually supporting all these ways rather than just focusing on the training in the future.
Yes, learning is becoming more individual, more immediate, more self-organized. Is the corporate world prepared for this? Some organizations, luckily the organizations I work for recognize this and want to move forward, and I help them. Not everybody does, for sure. It's still something that is still a bit of a problem for them. They still want to do things in very traditional top-down ways, as I said earlier. But there are also managers and teams who realize they need to change things. So I think we're seeing lots of pockets of change happening, perhaps not necessarily organizational strategy to do it, but it is beginning to happen. Individuals are certainly doing much more for themselves. So managers are recognizing they need to do things differently, and eventually maybe some of the senior managers will start to realize this needs to be their future strategy. What about the future prospects for management trainers? What happened to professional instructors when learning gets more and more self-directed?
Well, I think there's always going to be a need for some training. That's not going to disappear, but I think the role will probably become much more facilitators and enablers, guides to where people can find the right things. They'll be supporting much more personalized approaches to learning, much more geared to where individuals need to find out more things, rather than providing, say, one-size-fits-all training programs. So again, that's a very difficult problem, because many trainers don't want to take on those roles, but where they do, I think they can have a really good impact in the organization, because they can really help to provide a very personalized service to their people.
And what about workshops? Do they have future as a format for learning?
Yeah, as long as they're very collaborative and interactive and they focus on helping people apply what they've learned rather than just broadcasting knowledge to people, they do have a part to play. And sometimes people do want to come out of their work to spend some time, perhaps brainstorming a problem or discussing something or applying something they've learned. So I think they're going to be around, but they're not going to be the full future. They're going to be part of the future.
Now that you have watched this video, think about how learning applies to you in your job. The video discussed how modern learning is self-organized, self-managed, and often self-facilitated. Workplace learning does not need to occur in groups. It can be independent. It's important to view learning on a continuum. Soenberg and Goldberg stress the importance of fostering curiosity in workplace learning situations because it encourages employees to investigate and learn, and thereby increases their openness to change. Singay said, organizations learn only through individuals who learn. With this presentation, you've learned about the history of workplace learning, how to define workplace learning, and useful theoretical foundations in support of learning and influencing an adult's ability to learn at work. Creating a learning environment at the workplace is critical. We've all been involved in a workplace situation where as an employee, we're first forced to learning something that doesn't seem relevant and don't make sense why you have to do it. I'd like to think of these as compliance modules, and nobody likes to complete compliance modules, and rarely does anyone discuss what they've learned as a result of taking them. Now think about if learning reacted to you and how it related to you and help you understand your job or a policy better. That might be a good use of your time, and maybe you had a hand in creating the learning activity to assist your coworkers. Let's go back to the rural hospital example again. What if the ambulance drivers participated in the simulation exercise alongside the doctors? Could the ambulance driver help get warming blankets if they knew where they were located in the ER? Sure thing. Or maybe because the ambulance drivers worked with the doctors and the nurses in the simulation exercise, they could have started an IV already so antibiotics were ready to be administered. Creating a learning environment where this can happen is essential to learning and efficient for the employer. But how do you hire the right employees who want to participate in workplace learning? Rio and Ridswell suggest curious adults possess both the technical and interpersonal dimension to engage in workplace learning. Hiring more curious employees might also be an attractive way to assist with the development of learning organizations, especially in emerging businesses and industries where high levels of curiosity and creativity are absolutely necessary for remaining ahead of the competition. Let's revisit the learning outcomes. We now know how workplace learning evolved to how it is used in business today. We've discussed examples of workplace learning methods and watched a video that asked you to consider your learner audience and to use blended methods. We've seen factors that influence learners in the workplace and see that it's necessary to involve them in the learning process. And we've looked at strategies to maximize the effectiveness of workplace learning by discussing the team approach and relevance to their situations. Thank you for your interest, and we hope that you learned about workplace learning in your workplace. For more information about where we found this information, please check out our references on the following slides.